A mention of this investment policy. What is that about?
Really interesting that we just heard that at the end there from Emmanuel Macron. He was asked really in the context of Huawei, the Chinese technology giant that's proved so controversial in certain parts of the world in its supply of 5G mobile technology. And what Emmanuel Macron said there, he was asked the question, what sectors are not open to Chinese investment? And his answer was those that are affected by national security or national sovereignty. And it is only right under EU rules, as the rule exists, that countries should have a say if there's going to be a majority stake taken in certain businesses by non-EU investors. And he did point out that applies to all non-EU investors and not just Chinese ones. Specifically on Huawei, though, he did say that it was a sector that they were right because of the element of national security involved in this network infrastructure to have an oversight. And that's reflecting a law that was passed this summer here in France, nicknamed the Huawei law, but not actually mentioning the name of the company in the text. And that essentially gives the Prime Minister the right to examine any contracts that might be done by mobile operators here in France with Huawei because of these concerns over security. Of course, Huawei has always said that there are no security concerns involved in using its networks. That was one element of the investment discussion. The other one that he mentioned, which perhaps might have broader implications, is what he said that China was continuing to discuss an EU investment policy. And that's really something that has been under talk since 2013. The idea is both to give security to European investors investing in China and to facilitate Chinese investment in Europe. It's firming up the rules around that. As I say, it's been under discussion for a very long time, but Emmanuel Macron listing it as a priority for something that needs to be worked on after this visit.
Stephen, you just mentioned this. Of course, we've had contracts in France, but it's not just good news for Paris. A lot of deals being discussed with Europe at the heart in a bid to show a more united front, and which was one of the aims of this trip, certainly.
And to do that, Emmanuel Macron brought with him the European Trade Commissioner, Phil Hogan, incoming Trade Commissioner, outgoing Agricultural Commissioner. But it was very important for Emmanuel Macron to show this as being a European trip. And we saw in many of his answers there him referring to European policy on certain issues, knowing that he's not speaking just for himself, but he's trying to also speak for more of the continent as well. One of the big agreements that was reached during this trip, which will have quite a big impact for companies across Europe, is China's agreement to support or to recognise geographical indicators for products. It's a very technical, well, perhaps not very technical, in fact, European rule, which essentially gives protection to things like Parma ham, Parmesan cheese, champagne, that essentially says you can't use those names unless they're from the place where they come from and they meet this very exacting standards for how they're produced. There are around 100 of those that will be recognised under this agreement, 26 of them French, mostly to do with wine, champagne being one of them, spirits and cheese. That's a sort of deal that means that it'll open up those export markets for those companies as well and make sure that they don't have to worry about counterfeits or cheaper knockoff versions of their products being sold in China.
Stephen, let's move on to one of the, let's say, overarching issues when it comes to this meeting. What role would you say is the US-China trade dispute playing at these talks between Macron and his Chinese counterpart?
Well, certainly only oblique mentions of the ongoing trade war between the United States and China. Emmanuel Macron saying earlier, again encouraging there being multilateral approaches to resolving issues, not like some countries that choose to pull out. Of course, that's a reference to the United States withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord as well. But essentially, what we can see, or what we could perhaps infer from the amount of these deals being done, these $15 billion worth of deals, is also perhaps waving a bit of a flag at Washington and saying, look, this is the sort of thing that you could be doing with China if you weren't having this tariff dispute. We do see certain sectors being opened up to European companies that perhaps could have been opened up to American companies. And, there'll certainly be people in Washington watching these developments very closely and perhaps spotting some opportunities for what are ongoing negotiations. We've been promised a phase one of an agreement between the US and China to de-escalate their tensions. No sign yet of that agreement coming through, but it's certainly something that's still ongoing.
Stephen Carroll, our business editor, thank you so much for that very interesting insight, the business perspective into the meeting